In a 4-month period beginning in December 2010, the Arab world has experienced a staggering upheaval involving no fewer than 11 countries. In April 2011, a panel of experts convened in San Diego to offer their analysis of the unfolding events in the region and to give historical context to these ongoing revolutions. In this segment, we hear answers to questions from the moderator and the audience.
As you well know, the National Democratic Party is sort of the illegitimate child, if you will, of Gamal Abdel Nasser's party or movement that started in Egypt with very much the same foundations, but even stronger than Al-Ba'ath party in Syria. And so that movement deteriorated into, the open economics and the market economy and became an oligarchy, especially after 1995. Well, some people have been arguing that in Syria we're witnessing a similar trend, where the Ba'ath party is again a collection of security agencies and patronage movements really all around the country, with people making money from being the big commerce and so on. And let's remind ourselves that nobody was more entrenched in society than the Communist Party of the USSR, and that collapsed. So what is to prevent a very entrenched party like Al-Ba'ath party in Syria from collapsing? So if you can answer that, I'd appreciate it.
Nothing. Nothing is to prevent it from collapsing. I don't want to exaggerate the difference. I just wanted to say that in Syria, it has more of a semblance of a party than the NDP did in Egypt. It doesn't mean it's actually like a sort of so entrenched that you can't move it. But I was just highlighting some of the differences, and the party does seem to penetrate deeper into society. That some of the experts you read, will say things like, when I see that in Egypt you had independent union labor movements organizing already from before these events against the regime. You don't, and maybe it's because we don't hear it, because it's also suppressed. But in Syria, you get the sense that they're not on board yet, and that perhaps they have just been they have bought in enough into the party that they are not yet mobilized, not willing to mobilize against it. So, but in response to your question directly, nothing is to prevent it. And I think a number of other things could go right, and the Ba'ath party could crumble.
Okay. Marjorie, a lot of people in the US and in the West brought up the issue of Rwanda and the failure of the international community to intervene in Rwanda, and then again in Darfur, some people bring up, to point out that we cannot afford the same type of scenario in Libya. And with respect to calling for a change in regime, well, they also called for Mubarak to go. And they called for Ben Ali. Well, nobody called for him to go. He left before anybody could call for him to go. And a lot of people in the left, we were demonstrating here in San Diego with placards that said Mubarak must go. So why the double standards? Why is it not okay for the U.S. to say Gaddafi must go, but it was okay for the left in the U.S. and eventually the U.S. government to say Mubarak must go?
Well, remember that the United States government resisted saying Mubarak must go until the last minute, until it was clear he was on the way out. And then they said, oh yes, Mubarak must go, very opportunistically. But they were trying to deal with Omar Suleiman, who was the vicious, he was the point man for the extraordinary rendition when the CIA would send people, detainees, to Egypt to be tortured. He is a very good friend of Hillary Clinton's and Joe Biden, and he was made by Mubarak vice president, and Mubarak was hoping that he could stay in power. So there's a lot of hypocrisy there. It has to do with oil. It has to do with the location in the Middle East. Rwanda and Darfur are not located in that same area, and I think that's the double standard, and that's why Bill Clinton kept the UN from taking a position of which would have, as I said before, could have prevented genocide in Rwanda, having gone into Darfur. So there is this hypocrisy, but it has to do with neoliberal and strategic geopolitical reasons. It has to do with the religious piece of it. The Christian Zionists who think that Jesus is only going to come back once the temple's rebuilt. And the temple won't be rebuilt if it's in Muslim, if Jerusalem is in Muslim hands. It's got to be in Jewish hands, and then we convert all the Jews to Christianity and kill them. Understand the Jews. But that is a piece of it. So there's the neoconservatives, and then there's the religious people, and then there's the big conglomerate oil companies, and then there's Africa. I mean, Libya is the only country in North Africa that's not getting on board with AFRICOM, and which the United States is pulling the strings. So it has everything to do with politics, geopolitical considerations, and really nothing to do with humanitarian motives.
Exactly. A little bit about that. So I'm going to say a couple things about Yemen, and then turn that into a question that anyone here can answer. I used to study Arabic in Yemen, and my old Arabic teacher, I've been emailing him. As soon as Egypt broke out, I went, oh, Yemen's going to be next. And sure enough, it was. So I said, how's it going? What's going on? And it started off, he said, those people, they're protesting, it's going on. It was sort of a they're over there type thing. But he said, I agree with them. I want Salah to go. And then like a few days later, he was at the protests, and he was protesting. And as time went on, recently he emailed me and said I was in the middle of the protest when snipers started shooting from the rooftops and killed 40 people. So he's really getting into it now. And one thing that I've noticed is he said, Friday, he'll send an email, Friday's the day of rage, we're going out and we're going to do this thing. The next day we're going to go and march to the presidential palace. And what I think the American media misses is that what it looks like when you watch the American media is these are just random people getting upset and going out in the streets. And sure, that's happening to a degree. But there are people organizing this. There are organizations like the Egyptian equivalent of the San Diego Coalition for Peace and Justice, or the Egyptian equivalent of Al-Awda, that are coming up with plans, coming up with ideas, coming up with tactics, like chanting Salmiya. Can you guys elaborate on this and talk a little bit about more what the media has failed to tell us about that?
Let me start, then somebody else can. Well, of course there are movements, and of course all of millions of people don't go out in the street just by random, right? And that just doesn't happen. And so, for decades now, there's been very strong mobilization and movements in prison and out of prison, and people oppressed and people working, trade unions, teachers, professors, all sorts of things. It's different in different countries depending on how repressive the regime is. Like Bashir said, Libya is not even a state in the real sense of the word, right? I mean, there are no state institutions there. So some of the institutions that existed in Tunisia that exist today, or that exist in Syria or Egypt, just don't exist in Libya, right? And so we have to look at each country in a nuanced way. So Egypt is an ancient country with institutions that are literally ancient, much more ancient than the US existed, right? And so they had the judiciary, and I mean, Egyptian film industry, for example, is the second oldest in the world. And so, that's an institution. There's a lot of institutions in Egypt. So it's a real country with a lot of institutions that had this burden of the Mubarak regime and is getting rid of it. Yemen, I think, is also an ancient country with a lot of ancient civilization and so on. But the situation in Yemen is much more fragmented than a country like Egypt, right? I mean, there's tribal fragmentation in Yemen, there's geographic fragmentation. Remember, Yemen used to be two countries, two decades ago, and then they unified. One of them was more pro-Soviet, the other one was pro-US, and so on. But there also, between the South and the North, there were real divisions in terms of the types of society that they had. The South tends to be more liberal, the North tends to be more tribal, more conservative, so all these kinds of divisions. A friend of my family's who used to be the Yemeni ambassador to the UN, I was asking my aunt in New York, she works at the UN, what does he say about this? He said he's very worried. He said, if you think Libya is bad, Yemen could be 10 times worse. If the regime in Yemen, like what's starting to happen, because the head of the army joined the revolution, right? And it could develop into this tribal war and Al-Qaeda is in Yemen, and there's all kinds of forces are in Yemen. The U.S. has military, the unarmed planes that shoot people in Yemen all the time, and so on. I think the situation in Yemen is very dangerous. What is so impressive, though, is I think they're learning from the Egyptian example by having this mass movement of millions of people, which is really impressive and quite peaceful so far. They have not fallen into the trap of Libya. If they do, I think it will be much worse than Libya. You will see much more bloodshed, much, much worse than Libya. That's what worries me about Yemen. I don't know if other people have more information.
No, I don't have more information on Yemen. I just wanted to comment on this question about mobilization and organization. First of all, I don't think we should forget that there are such things as spontaneous movements. It doesn't mean... let's not undermine the spontaneity of a lot of this stuff just because there is organization at some level. If you were to only mobilize the people who are organized, you'd be mobilizing a very small number of people. Yeah? So a small number of people, of course, organize. And you have the April 6th movement in Egypt, you have all these youth movements in Egypt organizing. But it's only when they're able to somehow touch people who are otherwise unorganized, and when the millions of people come out in the street, that the movement succeeds. So that requires speaking to issues or using slogans or identifying goals that really reach a lot of people. I think in the case of Yemen, it's been very clear. It's directed at Saleh. Now, what will happen after that? Who knows? And people keep asking that, but I wonder why we need to ask that. It matters that they get rid of Saleh, and at least that's the beginning. That's the opening up of a possibility. So, what that tells us about organizing is that organizing means being strategic enough that one can reach large numbers of people by highlighting those goals that a large number of people can actually stand behind, and not narrowing our goals further and further so that fewer and fewer people can follow us, here and there.
Let me quickly add something. Also, speaking of organizing, there is an overemphasis on technology, in particular Facebook, Twitter, and satellite dishes and so forth. And also, not only that, part of denying the Arab people their agency, they learned this one from someone in Bosnia or someone in Boston and so forth. I mean, this is really, in addition to the spontaneity element of this uprising, you have a very sophisticated network of forms of organizing. That's really what end up not only achieving a goal within a short period of time, meaning toppling two regimes that have been entrenched into a great deal of in power for so many years, but also they continue to press. I mean, as a matter of fact, Tunisia looked more promising, relatively speaking, compared to Egypt. But nevertheless, day after day, again, you mentioned the example of Egypt, till yesterday, they end up mobilizing thousands of people to go back to Tahrir Square. They are continuing to push, and they are persisting, and therefore, yes, revolution does not happen all at once. Once the symbol of the regime is gone, you have a hard task, the challenge facing the revolution of building really the infrastructure, of building what you might call a civic organizations, groups that aim at tackling the issue of development. This is a critical issue relating to poverty, relating to literacy, economic development, dealing with a huge gap of inequality, and so forth. Speaking of Libya, here's a fascinating kind of comparison. In Libya, the people were not armed to start with, and they become armed. In Yemen, they were armed to start with, but they left their arms in their homes. So therefore, and they've been going at it, by the way, for several weeks. A lot longer than many of the revolutions in Tunisia as well as Egypt. So that's another dimension. Second dimension, there is no deniability that the tribal element and so forth, the sectarian element, this is always has been used both by colonial powers, divide and rule, and by the regimes themselves. By the way, in this case, they agree. Now the challenge is really, it's definitely one of the poorest within the region. Number two, you have the US, until very recently, emphasizing, quote unquote, the significance of Yemen, how they are not let go of Saleh. In addition, you have Saudi Arabia as a major player and the other Gulf states. Unlike where they devote the Gulf states, that is the Gulf Cooperating Council, $20 billion to prop up the regime in Bahrain and Oman, nothing for Yemen. And this has been always the kind of pattern where Yemen has been really marginalized. Even they refuse to include it within the GCC. It's definitely excluded. Those are really the only thread that Saleh is still holding on to, but I guess also his days are numbered as well.
I tell people, all you need is spend 10 minutes, if you're progressive-minded, to see the apartheid in Israel on the ground. And the reason it only takes 10 minutes is because that's how long it takes you to go from the airport to get to Highway 6, and you see the wall, where on one part of the wall you spend 7 minutes or so. It's the Israeli part, and there are all kinds of murals and flowers growing. You don't even see the wall. And then when you cross over to get to the West Bank,
which Israelis aren't allowed to do.
Well, yeah, except for settlers. And you then cross into a completely different world, right, where the same wall is devastating from the Palestinian side, right? And so it's this dual reality that's separated by a wall. I mean, it's literally a few meters, right? And Israelis live in a state that has nothing to do with the existence of the Palestinians, their neighbors, and the people who they stole the land of. And their existence is just completely, I mean, for most Israeli Jews, and one of my best friends is American, whose parents are Israeli Jews, and he grew up there. Until he met me, he had never spoken to a Palestinian. And that's common. So really you have a state, and the definition of a garrison state really fits. It's a state that lives as a garrison. And within the garrison, sometimes you have very good times. And it's a prosperous state, it's a flourishing country. But this garrison, weighs down on you. And you cannot think except what you've done to the other, the Palestinians. And every time you think of that, you say, oh shit, they're going to come after me because I destroyed them. They know that. I mean, Israelis know in their hearts what they've done, the original sin. That will never go away. And that's why when you see this fanatic reaction to any security threat or something like that, I think it's real. I don't think they fake it. But it's psychotic, right? It comes from this feeling that they have wronged, just like we had against the Native Americans, until we weakened them so much that they couldn't do anything to us, and then the U.S. was safe. And the same thing we did with the African Americans. I mean, you see this trend of people who oppress, fearing the oppressed, so much so that they establish all kinds of, theory around it and all kinds of existence. And in Israel, it's the worst there is today. And so I think what you've noticed as somebody who's traveled on a propaganda tour, now imagine Palestinians, because they're getting the other end of that. So most Israelis think of Palestinians as if when people talk about illegal immigrants, they say, well, we have that problem in Israel. No, you don't. These are the original owners of the land. They're not immigrants of this land, right? These are people you've killed and destroyed, and they think of them as a burden, as a demographic bomb, as a threat, all these racist, insulting terms. And very few Israelis stop to actually think, oh my God, how could I think of the human beings that were on this land when I came as a demographic threat? That kind of thing.
The fundamental thing about Israel is that it has not changed its Zionist ideology. Okay, this is the fundamental thing that underlies everything to do with Israel. And what they believe in is in establishing an exclusive Jewish state in all of Palestine. What exclusive means is that they want all the Arabs, all the Palestinians, either to disappear or to kill them or to expel them, whichever way they can do it. My wife and I are from two different parts of Palestine. My wife is from the West Bank, it's city of Betunia, village of Betunia. I'm from Haifa. We are not allowed to live together. Okay? In Galilee, which is the northern part, I'm talking about areas that were occupied in 1948, not 1967. Palestinians own 97% of the land in the Galilee. We are the majority population in the Galilee till today, okay? Despite all efforts to Judaize the Galilee, which is the northern part of the country. we are allowed to use less than 3% of the land. Okay? And each town, each village, their land was confiscated around each one of them. For example, Sakhnin, which is the 4th largest Arab town in present-day Israel, used to have 80,000 dunams of land. Okay, was that 2.2 acres per dunam or something like that? Now they have 10,000 dunams. So the population is growing, so they have to build up the way. And all the land around them is surrounded by settlements. That's what they are. Same thing as in the West Bank. The same happens around all other Arab villages, Rami, you name it. There are Nazareth is surrounded by upper Nazareth, elite, which is a very, it's like in-your-face apartheid. If you look at in the Nakab region, what they call the Negev, the southern part of Palestine, there are what they call unrecognized villages that have been in existence since centuries. Okay, long before the state of Israel, they call them unrecognized villages, which they don't, even though they pay taxes like everybody else, they don't get any services whatsoever, and they've been systematically destroying them, and the people rebuild. This has been happening. This is recent. This is not new. Okay. So when you talk about occupation, when you talk about human rights, when you talk about those fundamental issues that we all believe in, or we should believe in, don't forget 48.
How afraid of these emerging Arab democracies is the U.S., and how afraid of these emerging Arab democracies is Israel?
Who would like to address that?
Can I say something about that?
Go ahead.
I don't think we have to think of it in terms of afraid. I mean, you can see that, as Marjorie pointed out, as Mubarak was looking weak, it became important for the U.S. to position itself on the winning side. I think with that turn, they have decided, it seems to me that the current administration has decided that it's important for them to appear to support Arab democracy. I think it's very important for us not to ask the question of whether they in fact support Arab democracy or not. I believe they're agnostic on this question. I don't think they care one way or the other. I think they'd like to appear to support Arab democracy, and they will do anything to create that appearance. Sometimes you can do that by doing all kinds of hypocritical things, but sometimes you reach the limit of your own hypocrisy, and you have to actually do something. But that should not mean that there isn't a change here. What this means for the US, and for those who are on the receiving end of US policy, is probably for the first time in modern history, American policy has to address ordinary people in the Arab world. It has to actually speak in a way that addresses their concerns. It has previously been able to ignore them entirely. It has been able to talk to the regimes at the expense of the interests of ordinary people. It now must find a language that they can understand and that they would agree with it, if it wants not to have them as its enemy. And I don't think it wants them as its enemy. So I don't think the US is opposed to Arab democracy. Arab democracy is a little bit of trouble for the US. But it's not necessarily something that they think will create like a huge challenge for them. They'll just have to learn to speak a language that ordinary Arab people might be responsive to. That can actually have an effect. I think that can have an effect on Israel, precisely because Arab foreign policy might find itself speaking a language that makes Israelis a little scared. It hasn't happened yet, but I think that's what we might expect to happen. We're not going to see major shifts in American foreign policy. I doubt that, at least anytime soon. But I think we will see something. That the Israelis are nervous for a good reason here.
I wanted to start by saying thanks to the panel and just been a great discussion. I'm really interested in this comment you just made, and also a statement you made a little while earlier as well, because I think that what makes the U.S. so nervous is the potential of these revolutions to really upset the apple cart as far as what the plans are that the U.S. has for the Middle East. And that's because revolutions are, I mean, they start with these people who just, in every country, I mean, one other thing I wanted to say was that everybody has the right to be free, right? Whether you live in a country that the US supports your government, or if the US opposes your government, or whether you live in a society that has tribal differences, or whether you live in a society that has a small, dangerous element in it, or whatever, all people in all these countries have the right to stand up to fight for their own freedom. But once they start to do that, they step out into the unknown, and they enter into a process that they don't know where it's going to end. But I think that during the course of that, they start to learn what sort of organization they need, what sort of tactics and strategies they need to follow in order to make the most out of their protests, in order to win the most. And it comes down to a question of power, and who has the actual power in a society. And when that transformation starts to happen, I mean, towards the end of the Mubarak regime, there were strikes breaking out all over Egypt. Some people have said that this was the straw that broke the camel's back in Egypt, that the military realized we just can't allow for a mass workers' movement to start to unfold across the country that starts to, I mean, we can throw Mubarak overboard, but we can't throw capitalism overboard. We can't throw all the capitalists, all the ruling class of Egypt overboard, and just let it be swallowed up by this revolution. We need to make some kind of a concession and let Mubarak go. But I think, though, that one of the dynamics that occurs in all these societies is that you have a ruling class, and you have a layer beyond them who are entrenched in their power, in their economic power. And although they may have their differences with their regime, those differences end when it comes to challenging their actual power base, right? And so that means that the working people, the youth, the people who are the driving force of this revolution, need to form organizations and need to become the power in their country, and not simply have the plan of handing it off to some other person from the ruling class to take over, and hopefully they run it in their interests. I don't have the answer for that because I don't live in any of these countries. I'm sure it looks different in different countries, but I think this is an essential component in the unfolding revolutions in the Middle East right now.